Have you ever felt like an outsider? Like people don't take you seriously? Maybe you had an idea, something bold, something different, and instead of support you got laughter, doubt, even ridicule. Or maybe at some point in your life someone called you a fool, and it stung. But what if I told you that being a fool might be the wisest thing you could ever do? Because history tells us something interesting. The fool isn't just a joke. The fool is a paradox, both ridiculous and profound, both reckless and insightful. And more than that, the fool might just be the most powerful figure in human history. Think about it. The fool is the only one who can challenge the king without losing his head. The fool is the only one who can speak the truth, not with anger, not with force, but with laughter. And because of that, people listen. So today, I want us to explore this figure, the fool, as more than just a character in stories, but as a way of thinking, a philosophy, maybe even a path to wisdom. We'll look at history, psychology, and the hidden power of foolishness. And by the end of this, maybe you'll see the fool in a whole new light. So let's begin. To understand the fool's power, we need to start from the beginning, how this character has shaped history. Now tell me in the comments, have you ever been called a fool? And if so, how did it make you feel? Let's talk about truth. Not the polished, comfortable truths people like to hear, but the raw, inconvenient ones, the ones that shake the foundations of power, the ones that expose hypocrisy, the ones that make people uncomfortable. Who dares to speak those truths? Not the wise men, not the scholars, not the rulers. No, it's the fool. The fool has always been the outsider, the one who operates on the edges of society, watching, observing, laughing. But don't mistake that laughter for ignorance, because sometimes the ones who seem the most foolish are actually the ones who understand life the most. Take Shakespeare's King Lear. The court is filled with noblemen, intelligent, respected, high-ranking men. And yet, the only person who dares to tell the truth to the king is the fool. While everyone else bows and flatters, the fool mocks Lear, ridicules his choices, and exposes his blind spots. And somehow Lear allows it, because deep down he knows the fool is the only one who isn't lying to him. Now, Shakespeare wasn't the only one who understood the fool's power. Now let's go back even further to one of the greatest thinkers of all time, Socrates. You know what's funny? Socrates is often seen as one of the wisest men in history. And yet, what was his most famous belief? I know that I know nothing. Think about that. In a world full of self-proclaimed experts, powerful rulers, and men who boasted of their knowledge, Socrates walked around openly admitting ignorance. And for that, people called him a fool. But was he, or was he the only one brave enough to admit the truth? He questioned everything. He made people uncomfortable. And because of that, he was condemned to death. Let's fast forward to the Renaissance, to a thinker named Erasmus. He wrote a book called In Praise of Folly, where he argued something radical. Foolishness isn't just necessary, it's divine. He said that human beings are full of contradictions. We chase money but talk about virtue. We claim to value truth, but we prefer comforting lies. And who exposes these contradictions? Not the scholars, not the preachers, the fools, the ones who laugh at power, who say what others won't, who refuse to pretend. Erasmus knew something we often forget. Sometimes the best way to reveal the absurdity of the world is to embrace it. The fool is not just a joke. The fool is a mirror showing society exactly what it refuses to see. And now that we understand how the fool has shaped history, let's go deeper. Why do we fear looking foolish? And how can embracing that fear set us free? Let me ask you something. If you walked into the court of a powerful king, someone with the authority to have you executed on a whim, would you dare to mock him? Would you joke about his bad decisions, his foolish wars, or his fragile ego, right to his face? Probably not. Most people wouldn't. And yet, there was one person in the royal court who could do exactly that and get away with it. The jester. In the medieval courts of Europe, rulers surrounded themselves with advisors, noblemen, and scholars. Men who whispered only what the king wanted to hear. But there was one voice in the room that was different. The fool. He could say what others could not. He could laugh at the king's failures. He could point out hypocrisy without fear of exile or execution. Why? Because the fool was seen as harmless. A joke. Someone whose words, no matter how sharp, were dismissed as mere entertainment. But was he really harmless? Or was he one of the most dangerous figures in the court? History gives us proof of just how much influence these jesters had. Take Triboulet, the jester of King Francis I of France. Triboulet was no ordinary entertainer. He was sharp, observant, and knew how to manipulate his position. He once insulted a nobleman so badly that the man demanded his execution. The king, bound by tradition, told Triboulet he could choose the way he wanted to die. And do you know what Triboulet said? "Good sire, I choose to die of old age." The king laughed so hard that he spared his life. Clever, isn't it? Or consider Archie Armstrong, the court jester of King James I of England. Unlike others in the court, Archie wasn't afraid to mock religious and political figures. In fact, his jokes were so controversial that he was eventually banished. But not before influencing major decisions by speaking truth disguised as humor. The fool didn't just challenge authority. He also played another crucial role, one that people often overlook. He was a mediator. Imagine a tense courtroom, a political crisis, two powerful figures on the brink of war, and in walks the fool, with a joke, a ridiculous dance, or a playful insult. He defuses the tension. He reminds people of their humanity, that beneath the crowns, the armor, and the titles, they are still just people. Humor is powerful. It lowers defenses. It softens even the hardest of hearts. Even today, you'll see how leaders use humor to gain favor, to calm a crowd, to turn enemies into allies. Psychologists have studied this. Laughter releases tension. It builds trust, creates a moment where even those who are divided can find common ground. The fool understood this long before science did. So, let me ask you, have you ever used humor to get out of a difficult situation? Have you ever turned a moment of tension into laughter and watched the entire energy shift? If you have, congratulations. You've tapped into the ancient wisdom of the fool. Now let's take a step deeper. So far, we've looked at the fool in history, jesters, truth-tellers, outsiders who dared to speak against power. But the fool isn't just a person in a king's court. The fool is a pattern, a recurring symbol, a force that appears again and again in myths, stories, and even within your own mind. Yes, inside you right now there is a fool. Carl Jung, one of the greatest psychologists of the modern age, believed that humanity shares universal archetypes, symbols and characters that appear across different cultures, religions, and time periods. And the fool is one of the most important, because the fool represents the beginning, the first step into the unknown. The willingness to take risks, to make mistakes, to be vulnerable. Think about any great story, any hero's journey. Where does it start? With someone who knows nothing, someone who is laughed at, underestimated, or even dismissed as foolish. the naive warrior who picks up a sword for the first time, the young student who asks too many questions, the dreamer with an idea so wild that everyone calls them crazy. But here's the secret: every sage was once a fool. The fool evolves. He stumbles. He falls. He learns. And one day, through experience, through failure, through persistence, he becomes wise. You see this idea everywhere. Joseph Campbell, the mythologist who studied ancient legends, called this the hero's journey, the story of transformation that appears in every culture. The fool is the first step of that journey. So tell me, have you ever looked back at a version of yourself from years ago and thought, wow, I was so naive back then? That's because you've grown. That's because you've walked further along the fool's path. And that brings us to one of the most fascinating representations of the fool in human history, one that exists not in literature, but in symbols. Let's talk about the Tarot Fool card number 0. 0. What a strange number, right? Not a beginning, not an end, just pure potential. If you look at the tarot card, you'll see a young man standing on the edge of a cliff, looking up at the sky, a small bag over his shoulder, a flower in his hand. He is about to take his first step. He doesn't know where the road leads. He doesn't know if there's solid ground ahead, or if he'll fall. And yet, he walks forward anyway. That is the essence of the fool. No fear, no hesitation, just trust in the journey. The fool doesn't hesitate. The fool moves. And that movement, that willingness to embrace the unknown, that is how real growth happens. So now I want to ask you, where in your life are you standing at the edge of a cliff, afraid to take the next step? Because here's the truth. There is no wisdom without foolishness first. And the moment you understand that, your entire perspective on life will begin to change. Let's pause for a moment. Think back to the last time someone called you foolish. Maybe they didn't use the word directly. Maybe it was the way they laughed at your idea, the way they dismissed your excitement, the way they made you feel small for trying something new. How did you react? The next time someone calls you a fool, ask yourself, are they right? Or are you simply ahead of them on the path to wisdom? This reaction, this deep discomfort at being seen as a fool, is one of the most powerful forces that shape human behavior. It's why people stay silent when they should speak. It's why they choose safety over adventure. It's why they seek validation instead of truth. And that is the ego trap. Why does being seen as foolish hurt so much? Because at its core, it threatens our sense of identity. We all have an image of ourselves that we try to maintain. Maybe you see yourself as intelligent, competent, respected. Maybe you've worked hard to build a reputation. And then someone comes along and shakes that foundation. They mock your ideas. They question your intelligence. They treat you like you don't know what you're doing. And suddenly, your mind goes into defense mode. You feel anger rising. How dare they? You feel the urge to explain yourself. I'll prove them wrong. Or worst of all, you start doubting yourself. What if they're right? And this is where most people get stuck. They become trapped in proving, defending, and seeking approval. They shape their lives around not looking foolish instead of actually living. Here's the hard truth: if you're constantly trying to avoid being seen as a fool, you're living for other people, not yourself. Think about how much energy people waste trying to be perceived as smart, successful, or respectable. They hesitate to ask questions because they don't want to look ignorant. They avoid taking risks because failure would be embarrassing. They measure their self-worth by how others see them, not how they see themselves. But tell me, who decides what is foolish? Because what looks like foolishness in one moment can turn into genius over time. The Wright brothers were mocked for believing humans could fly. Einstein was labeled a failure as a student. Even the great philosophers Socrates, Confucius, Nietzsche were called fools in their time. So let me ask you, how many of your own dreams, your own ideas, your own truths have you ignored just because you were afraid of looking foolish? And more importantly, who are you living for? Yourself or the approval of others? So how do we escape this? How do we stop fearing judgment and start embracing our own path? It begins with accepting imperfection. Let me say this clearly, you will look foolish at times. You will make mistakes. You will say the wrong thing, take the wrong step, fall flat on your face. And that's okay. That's necessary. Because confidence doesn't come from being perfect. It comes from being comfortable with imperfection. It comes from knowing that your worth isn't tied to how others see you, but to how deeply you live your truth. So, the next time you hesitate, whether it's to speak up, to take a risk, to chase something that excites you, ask yourself, am I afraid of failing? Or am I just afraid of looking like a fool? And if it's the second one, then maybe, just maybe, that's exactly what you need to do. We've seen the fool throughout history, jesters, philosophers, tricksters, and sages. But here's the real question. Where do we see the fool today? Because make no mistake, the fool isn't just some relic of the past, some character locked away in Shakespearean plays or ancient myths. No, the fool is alive and well. You see him on your screens. You hear him in podcasts. You laugh at him on social media. And yet, what if I told you that some of the most ridiculed people in our modern world, the ones we mock, dismiss, and call crazy, are often the ones shaping the future? Think about Elon Musk for a second. Love him or hate him, you can't ignore him. This is a man who, at multiple points in his career, has been laughed at, called insane, dismissed as a fool. You want to build electric cars? Ha! No one will buy them. You think people will ever go to Mars? Dream on. You want to build reusable rockets? Impossible. And yet, he keeps proving the doubters wrong. What makes Musk a fool? It's his willingness to take massive risks, to ignore conventional wisdom, to embrace failure. And that's the core of the fool archetype. He steps where others fear to tread. But here's the thing. What if he had listened to the laughter? What if he let people's ridicule stop him? Now, let me ask you, has there ever been a time in your life where you had a bold idea, but people around you laughed at it? Maybe you wanted to start a business. Maybe you wanted to change careers. Maybe you had an idea that no one else believed in. Tell me in the comments, what's one idea you had that others dismissed? And do you regret not following through? Now let's shift gears for a moment. Not all fools are bold entrepreneurs. Some are simple, innocent, and deeply relatable. Take Mr. Bean, a character so ridiculous, so childlike, that he hardly even speaks. And yet, millions around the world adore him. Why? Because Mr. Bean navigates the world in a way that we secretly wish we could. He doesn't follow social norms. He doesn't care about looking stupid. He finds joy in the simplest things. He reminds us that sometimes life isn't about being the smartest, the most capable, or the most respected. Sometimes it's just about being present, being playful, being curious. And that's another side of the fool. The one who teaches us that life isn't meant to be so serious. We've explored the fool as the outsider, the truth teller, the disruptor. But now we must look at something even deeper, the transformation of the fool. Because, you see, the fool isn't meant to stay foolish. His journey is not just about laughter and rebellion. It's about growth, evolution, becoming something greater. But here's the catch, true wisdom is born through failure. And that's what separates the fool from the rest of the world. Most people fear failure. They avoid embarrassment. They cling to certainty. But the fool, he steps forward anyway. He stumbles. He falls. He gets laughed at. But in the process, he learns. And by the end of his journey, he is no longer just the fool. He has transformed. The real question is, how much of your own vision have you abandoned because people told you it was foolish? Because here's the hard truth. Most people don't lack intelligence. They lack the courage to look foolish. Let me leave you with one final thought. What if everything you've been taught about wisdom is wrong? What if the key to living a full, fearless, and truly meaningful life is not to be the smartest, the most serious, or the most respected, but to be the fool? Because now, after everything we've explored, the jesters, the tricksters, the outcasts, the comedians, tell me honestly, who would you rather be? The one who spends their life trapped by fear, worried about what others think, terrified of making mistakes, paralyzed by the idea of looking ridiculous? Or the one who laughs in the face of failure, dances through the chaos of life, and embraces uncertainty with open arms? The choice is yours. Let's break it down. What have we learned about the fool? The fool exposes the truth while making us laugh. Think of the court jesters, the comedians, the tricksters. They could say what no one else dared to say. They could make us see reality by disguising it in humor. The fool embraces failure without fear. He jumps off the cliff before he even checks if he has wings. He understands that every failure is just another step toward mastery. The fool seeks self-awareness over external approval. He doesn't chase applause. He doesn't beg for validation. He lives by his own truth, no matter how ridiculous it looks to others. The fool dares to question authority and convention. He is the glitch in the system, the crack in the wall, the voice whispering, "Are you sure this is the only way?" while everyone else blindly follows. And most importantly, the fool is free. Free from fear, free from control, free to truly live. And that's why the fool's journey is the path to real wisdom. So now the question is, are you ready to embrace your inner fool? Are you ready to take the risk, to step outside the rules, to chase that idea, to start that project, to say what you really think, to live without fear of looking ridiculous? I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments, what is one characteristic of a fool that you know? And if you've made it this far, subscribe to the channel. Because trust me, we're just getting started. There's a lot more wisdom hiding in the places you'd least expect. And I can't wait to explore it with you. See you in the next one.